I'm Casey Vance, Executive Director at the Ames History Museum, and I want to welcome everybody here tonight to our online lecture series program. We're really happy that we're able to get together online, even though we're not able to all be together in person, and that we're able to still present some of these lecture series programs this spring. I'm going to go ahead and put a poll up on the screen now, and it just asks how many people are watching with you. If you have more than just you on your screen there. And that will help us just get a more accurate count of how many people are attending this lecture. So thanks for participating in that. This program is being recorded, so if you need to leave early or if you lose connection, no worries. The recording will be emailed to you tomorrow. And if you have any questions for Doug during the lecture, please go ahead and use the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring the questions throughout the lecture, and we'll have Doug answer them at the end. And finally, I just want to recognize our annual lecture series partner, Ames Public Library. We're so happy to have this great partnership, and now I'll go ahead and pass it over to Kathy Cooney from the library.
Thanks, Casey. We are also thrilled to have this great partnership, and normally we would be presenting this program from the Ames Public Library Auditorium, but since that's not possible tonight, welcome to the virtual Ames Public Library for the Story County Courthouse fight. I just want to take a minute to remind you that our mission is to connect you to the world of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. And to mention that although many things have changed in the last few months, the library is still serving the community in a variety of ways with digital streaming services, daily content on our social media, a weekly radio show every Wednesday at noon on KHOI, and something new starting July 1st, the lobby will be open for limited services like holds pickup and checkout of grab-and-go bags and quick pick collections. We're excited to be able to start welcoming our community members back. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Kathy Speck to introduce tonight's presenter.
I know we're very pleased to have Doug back again. He's one of our favorite presenters, and we love his animated style of telling history stories. Doug was born and grew up in Ames, where his father, Don, taught geology at Iowa State. Doug's BA and MA are from Iowa State, and his PhD is from the University of Minnesota. He is currently a professor of history at the University of Nebraska-Kearney. Doug says that when he got to college, he had really great instructors in the medieval and ancient time periods that inspired him to go into medieval studies. Doug has taught in both American and British universities and has been a visiting professor at the Medieval Studies Center at the University of York in the UK, and has given papers at professional conferences on both sides of the Atlantic as well as New Zealand. In the year 2000, he was elected to fellowship in the Royal Historical Society, a group of about 2,500 historians, all of whom have made substantial published contribution to the field of British studies. So you might ask, what's he doing here talking about local history? So in 2009, he expanded his historical interest to include the history of Ames and Iowa State, producing scholarly articles and publications in ISU's alumni magazine, Visions, as well as local history lectures. And we're so glad he's branched off into a whole new arena. For the Ames Sesquicentennial in 2014, Doug and his wife, Gloria Betcher, co-authored a book on Ames history that is for sale at the museum. And he just told me that he has won a Fulbright to the Czech Republic for January through June, and he really hopes that everything will go well enough so that he can actually go to the Czech Republic. So without further ado, please welcome Doug Beets.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks for that wonderful intro. Thanks also to Kathy at the library for hosting this, and also to Casey for hosting this as well. This is one of the things I really enjoy doing when I get invited to do this, and I never turn it down. So it's a lot of fun. This is a project that you're going to hear about tonight that's actually part of a much larger project. As in most everything that you do, you run across something that is interesting when you're already doing something else and you decide to go back to it. So this is part of what I hope will be an article for the Annals of Iowa down the road. I just need time to get at it and get research, and we need to get into the archives and do that. And right now that's really difficult to do. So anyway, without further ado, let me share my screen here and make sure this is going to work. And then, where are we at? Right there. Okay. The title comes from, as we'll talk about at the very end, an Ames newspaper. And I'm still not really quite sure what that sentence is supposed to mean. I ran across it, again, looking for something else, and I just thought it was so strange that I had to use it in some way. And it seemed fitting to kind of put in with this courthouse mess. But this is part of who we are, or who we were, and I guess still are, in Story County. And it's, I hope, a story that you'll find entertaining and interesting, and maybe can take something away from when next time you're driving to Nevada to pay a bill or something, or go visit a courthouse. Fights between cities and towns over issues such as water rights, land rights, and political tomfoolery are all part of the American historical landscape. So too are fights between communities over who received and or retained the county seat. The early history of Iowa is replete with examples of this phenomenon. For example, Buena Vista County, formed in 1851, went through a series of legal battles where dishonest public officials, unscrupulous political maneuvering, and actual fraudulent use of public funds combined to delay the breaking of ground for the county courthouse in Storm Lake until 1869. Story County was another Iowa county where a series of internecine conflicts took place in the 1860s and 1870s between the original and still serving county seat of Nevada and its upstart rival 15 miles to its west, Ames. The unfortunate lack of any issues of the Ames Intelligencer, Ames's first newspaper, from the Intelligencer's first issue in April of 1868 until August of 1876, leaves out one of the most important and fun sides of this story. And what we're left with are the Nevada and Des Moines newspapers to fill much of the gaps, along with legal documents preserved at the county courthouse and the capital, Des Moines. Nevertheless, we were able to catch more than a glimpse of this conflict that went on between these two communities in these years. There is no doubt that some of Ames's most prominent citizens of the day, aided by many at the Agricultural College, 2 miles to the west of downtown, were willing to do way more than just bend the rules in their attempts to take the courthouse, the jail, and the county fair, and thus the county seat, away from Ames's self-proclaimed rival in Nevada. Now, settlers had been flowing into what became Story County even before statehood in 1846, but the county administrative structure was not codified until Nevada was platted in 1853 and was named the county seat on July 27th of that year. Nevada was an excellent choice because it sat more or less at the geographical center of the county, and thus it was equidistant from all residents. Nevertheless, before the coming of the railroad to the central part of the state in 1863 and 1864, Story County was sparsely populated, and the majority of its residents lived on the eastern side of the Skunk. Now, in our time, of course, the Skunk is no barrier to travel at all. There are no fewer than 5 bridges across the river within the Ames city limits alone, and many of us cross these bridges a number of times a day without even thinking. And this is, it originally sat across the Skunk at Cambridge, but was moved up to just the southern part of Ames, and it's now kind of a footbridge at the far southeastern part of town. It's kind of a fun, little picture to use here. It is easy for us in our time to visit the Story County Administrative Center, to pay property taxes, buy a new license plate, incorporate our business, sell land, buy land, etc. But in the 1850s and 60s, The Skunk River, with its broad, boggy floodplain, represented a major barrier to travel and communication. Even after the arrival of the railroad in 1863 and 1864, if you lived on the western side of the county, traveling to Nevada to conduct any business that you needed to do with the county seat was time-consuming, frustrating, and depending on the time of year you went, it could be somewhat dangerous. While most residents in these early decades lived on the eastern side of the Skunk, one of the county's most significant institutions was placed to the west of the river, Iowa Agricultural College and the Model Farm. The site selected for the Model Farm and Ag College in 1858 by the legislature had more to do with politics than practicality. Story County had promised the state to, with Boone County, no less than $20,000 to put both of those institutions within Story County, within its boundaries. And thus, when Story County was chosen for the site of the college and farm, they had to be built close to Boone County so that Boone County farmers could at least take initial advantage of the presence of these two institutions so close to them. Thus, both house and farm were sited over the west bank of the Skunk and the Squaw Creek, roughly 15 miles from Nevada to the east and 15 miles from Boone to the west. The farm itself had little political impact on the county, and the fact that the college was not staffed with buildings ready for students until 1869 meant that in these very early years before the students arrived and faculty arrived on campus, the college really doesn't have, and the farm doesn't really have a whole lot to do in county politics. They will, but they don't right away. The founding of Ames, of course, was due to the presence of John Inslee Blair's Cedar Rapids and Missouri Railroad, which was soon to become the Chicago and Northwestern. Okay, there's John Blair. Blair moved his rails through the central Iowa townships of Story County in 1863 and 1864. And there's one of the stock certificates for the Cedar Rapids and Missouri River Railroad that soon became the CNNW. Ames was officially platted on December 17th, 1864, and consisted of about 12 blocks north of Blair's right-of-way. A number of settlers who made up Ames at its inception seemed to have envisioned a community of rather grand designs. And with the coming of Blair's railroad, the model farm and planned college were no longer so isolated. The coming of the war in 1861 drove all, or almost all, local political issues into the background, which emerged after the war with renewed vigor. Many of Ames' early citizen leaders had big plans for their little village, and even before the city was incorporated, because Ames isn't incorporated until 1870, the village became embroiled with a series of battles with Nevada over political and economic issues. The first of these fights centered on the location of a narrow gauge railroad, and the second over where to put the county fair. In 1866, this guy here on the left of the screen, Des Moines banker James Callanan, was gathering funds to begin a narrow gauge railroad that he wanted to run from Des Moines to Minneapolis, that became known variously as the Des Moines and Minnesota, the Des Moines and Minneapolis, or simply as the Iowa and Minnesota Railroad. There was a great amount of controversy over Callanan's railroad because both Ames and Nevada wanted the Iowa and Minnesota to cross Blair's Chicago and Northwestern in their town, their respective towns. Each city knew that a railroad that connected the newly selected state capital in Des Moines would be a powerful inducement for development in their town. And one of Callanan's principal investors was none other than Lucien Q. Hoggett of Ames, who supplied land near Ames for Callanan's railroad with alacrity. For its part in the contest, Nevada paid over $400 to a survey company to entice Callanan's railroad to cross the Skunk River from, Des Moines, you got to cross it to get to Nevada, before continuing north up to Minneapolis. But the wily Ames City Fathers outmaneuvered Nevada by promising a 5% local tax to actually fund Callinan's construction costs through this part of the county. William Orson Payne, in his 1911 History of Story County, argued that the barrier of the skunk, the extra cost necessary to throw a bridge across the river and maintain it, and the presence of at least under construction, agricultural college were factors that led Callinan to build his road through Ames rather than Nevada. Regardless of the reasons, Nevada was not happy with Callinan's choice and gave vent to their frustrations in the leading Story County newspaper, the Story County Aegis, in July of 1866, noting that they had simply been led on, swindled by a corrupt businessman and railroad man, James Callinan, to waste $400 of Nevada money for no return. The success of securing 2 transecting railroads in as many years emboldened Ames to then begin to take, or try to take, the county fair and eventually the county seat from Nevada. Now, the first Story County Fair had been held in 1859 in Nevada. But in the sparsely populated Story County of that time, trying to move goods, people, and livestock to the county seat, sometimes in some cases a day or 2 or 3 away, was no small affair. And logistically, it was impossible to actually have the county fair or hold the county fair after 1859. It was kind of an experiment that failed. The war, which, as Payne noted, consumed everything that it did not pertain to itself, interrupted the fair as well. The county held no fairs from 1859 to 1865 and didn't hold one in 1866 or 1867, in spite of the fact that there were railroads that could have connected various parts of did connect various parts of the county to Nevada. They just didn't have the administrative wherewithal to do it. So in 1868, a group of Ames men decided on their own to host the county fair in Ames instead of in Nevada. As county fairs were traditionally held at the county seat, this represents the kind of opening salvo in Ames's attempt to wrest the courthouse and the county seat from its neighbor to the east. Indeed, for those Ames citizens who sought to move the county seat to their fair city, the time in 1868 was ripe for such a move. I mean, Nevada was, yes, the legally recognized county seat, but if you were in Ames, you could argue, and you could argue with some validity, that it was in name only. Nevada was in name only the county seat. By 1868, Nevada had no permanent county fairgrounds, no jail, and no courthouse. Now, Nevada had built, or the county, I should say, had built a courthouse of sorts in the 1850s, but it was a simple wooden structure that was supposed to serve the purpose of the courthouse and jail until a bond issue could be levied and a proper fireproof brick one built. The original wooden courthouse served until the middle of the Civil War, when it burned down on the night of December 31st, 1863 and January 1st, 1864. And if you ever have a chance to, or occasion to read about this whole mess, you will get conflicting dates. Some sources will tell you the fire happened in 1863, others will tell you it happened in 1864. Well, they're both technically right, because the fire starts in the evening of December 31st and carries over into the morning. So it's a bit of a confusing, but once you figure that out, it makes sense. It's kind of a weird day. That night of December 31st, 1863, we are told in newspapers, was particularly cold, and the caretaker had left oil heaters burning in the overnight to keep the building at a minimum temperature. Unfortunately, the lamps were not well attended. It was New Year's Eve, after all. A fire broke out and the courthouse burned. Of course, being as this burned in the middle of the war, there was no money, and no money could be raised in a bond issue. The county board couldn't do anything about it. And they had to use existing tax receipts to build another kind of shanty structure to act as the courthouse until the war was over and something permanent could be built. The end of the war brought a return to normalcy, but it also brought a large influx of new settlers to the county. Now, to be fair, some folks didn't stop, or they stopped for a very brief period of time. They'd move into the county, they'd settle down, they'd buy a farm, or they'd open a business, and then they decide to pick up and move to the west, further out of the county, many of them further out of the state. But others, and names we are all in Ames familiar with, like Wallace Greeley, Kendrick Brown, James Jones, and others, settled here in Ames while many others moved over the western bank of the Skunk and built small communities and farms in the western portions of the county where land was both plentiful and affordable. As population increased and life returned to normal, as it were, so too did tax receipts. And the County Board of Supervisors turned their minds in the later 1860s towards building a new courthouse. And this is where things get interesting. In 1868, the board submitted a proposal to the electorate for the county to raise $30,000 by issuing a 10-year bond issue with a 7% yield. And the proceeds from all that would build the new courthouse. Excuse me. Ames led the opposition to the new courthouse for the townships on the western side of the Skunk, centered on the argument that the increase in taxes that the bond issue would bring was a really bad idea. Opposition to the new courthouse bond issue ran high in the western townships and farms. But even in Nevada itself in 1868, support for that bond issue that year was only lukewarm. It is possible, maybe probable, that the tepid response to the 1868 courthouse bond issue on the part of Nevada rested in Nevada's own somewhat foolish attempts to get the state capital moved to Nevada. I know this sounds far-fetched, but this is what's in the newspapers. Even though Des Moines had been chosen for the site for the new capital by the legislature in 1854, only a temporary structure had been built. And in fact, the legislature did not actually determine to fund a permanent Capitol building, this beautiful thing, until July of 1870. Now, John Blair, our dapper railroad man about town, knew this, and he also knew that a lot of people would ride the train, whoever's train it was, and he wanted it to be his, to the state capitol. And if it was his train, then his cash boxes would be full. Because as everybody knows, Des Moines would have been, or as it is now, the center of politics, and all people flow into Des Moines and flow out of Des Moines. If it was on his railroad, which of course runs straight through Story County, Nevada, to Ames, and then on out toward Boone, think of all the money that Blair would make. So what Blair does, somewhat slimily, is he promised the state of Iowa a sum of $1 million in cash, the rough estimate of what it was going to cost to build a beautiful state capitol. And if the legislature would move the location of the capital away from Des Moines to a spot on his railroad, this is what the state would get. Now, the great railroad man, however, was far too shrewd a businessman to just simply give $1 million of his own money to such a project. So he incentivized his plottings and plannings by promising $250,000 in cash of his own money to the state if, any other community, i.e. the communities on his railroad line, would come up with the remaining $750,000 and then use their local influence with their legislators and senators to get the legislature to move the capital from Des Moines to somewhere on his railroad line. A group of Nevada businessmen took up this challenge. They argued that Nevada was much closer to the geographic center of the state than Des Moines, which is actually sort of true, and responded to Blair's initiative in March of 1868 by promising $750,000, which quite frankly they did not have, to the state if they would move the capital, the site of the capital, from Des Moines to Nevada. Of course, this effort failed miserably, but it did occupy much of Nevada's attention and many of their aspirations throughout all of 1868 and actually a little bit into 1869. While Nevada and the townships on the western side of the Skunk spent their energies fighting against the courthouse bond issue or concentrated on other matters like trying to get the capital moved to their city, the County Board of Supervisors tried to move forward. In September of 1868, the three-member board considered postponing the vote on the bond issue because by all measures and by all standards, the three board members knew that this wasn't going to pass. Come hell or high water, this wasn't going to pass. So they wanted to postpone it. The board's fears were not unfounded, and less than 2 months later, the electorate overwhelmingly rejected the bond issue. Undaunted, in their November meeting, after the results were in, the county board voted to put another bond issue before the electorate in the coming year. This time, the board wanted to raise $40,000 in cash through a bond issue with a 10-year life of the bonds, and to sweeten the pot, they upped the interest rate from 7% to 10% to encourage investors in the county to actually get them to, build a real courthouse. If anything, this bond issue seems only to have succeeded in being more unpopular than the first one, and it was resoundingly defeated. The last act in this part of the drama came in the following year of 1869, when a proposal was put before the county board just to build the jail in Nevada, which of course would have, kind of solidified Nevada as the county seat. The board formed a committee to propose another bond issue, but opposition to even a jail came from so many parts of the county and was so strong that the board never put it before the electorate. As Payne suggests, this issue was not as divisive as it might have been, but it created enough bad blood on both sides of the Skunk to postpone the entire issue of a new courthouse for 5 years until 1874. Over these 5 years, forces from the village of Ames and their new ally, Iowa Agricultural College, which entered the fray with the first class of students in 1869, pressed for Ames to become the administrative center of the county. Since the end of the war, in 1865, Ames residents had been more than forthcoming with their glowing recommendations about the growth of their new town in the most prominent newspaper in the county, the Nevada-based Story County Aegis. In March of 1867, for example, Civil War veteran Captain Lindsay Andrews could hardly contain his enthusiasm for what, in his opinion, had become a boom town, Ames. He encouraged all the readers of the county newspaper to move to the thriving new community of Ames, his words, leaving the dull, worn, dilapidated, backward Nevada behind. The Iowa State Register, one of the major newspapers in Des Moines, reported in 1867 that a group of Ames men had formed an agricultural society, and of course then went on to host a county fair in 1868, as we've already heard. The group's leadership consisted of William West, the president of the Ag Society, who, not quite coincidentally, is the first mayor of Ames, George Childs as vice president, and W.D. Lucas as treasurer. Again, all names we're familiar with as Ames historians. While Ames was not yet incorporated, This group proposed that the county fair afterwards be held in a location near Ames. And of course, the Nevada newspapers just went ballistic over this, that this was poaching and this was illegal and this was immoral, and this is a whole bunch of things. The war of words and poaching in the county fair were perhaps more annoying than significant because Ames could accomplish little until it was actually an incorporated community. To solve this problem, in December of 1869, the town of Ames was given, the electorate of Ames was given the question of whether or not Ames should be incorporated. When the votes came in, 106 ballots were cast, with 81 voting for incorporation and only 25 against. The presence of a now functioning IAC that contained faculty educated in the agricultural and mechanical arts just 2 miles to the west of the city greatly affected Ames politics in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, all the way down to today. It's not always clear exactly how IAC was involved in Ames's plans and policies because the nature of the sources that survive are really pretty opaque on this issue. But it is clear that the college was very much involved in both. For example, the first president of IAC, Adoniah Welch, loaned the city of Ames a substantial amount of cash in early 1870. While the city council minutes do not record the amount of the loan, the fact that the first interest payment was $50 in 1870 more than suggests that it was a significant amount of money. It is possible that the money Welch loaned the city went to the building of the new bridge over the Skunk on the Nevada Road, which is what we call Old 30. And that's a picture of it in 1870, right after it was built. In May of 1870, the city council negotiated with Professor George Jones, the guy there on the left, professor of math and structural engineer, to design a bridge to cross the Skunk, which was later built. Perhaps the most significant intrusion of IAC into Ames and Story County politics comes in March of 1870, when a group of Ames and college leaders incorporated the Iowa Agricultural District Association, or the IACDA. This new company was an outgrowth of that Agricultural Society of 1867 that had, quote unquote, poached the county fair in 1868. The two organizations shared some of the men who served on the board of directors, but most of the local Ames men, except for William West, who served as treasurer, were gone and replaced by men from the Ag College. President A.S. Welch at the head of it, along with the former director of the college farm as one of the directors, and several members of the IAC Board of Trustees. No conflicts of interest here. The organization's stated purpose in their articles of incorporation was to foster education in the agricultural, mechanical, and fine arts, and to hold annual fairs. This new organization represents a blending or joining of forces between the college and city. And the fact that important agriculturalists in the state who were on IAC's board of trustees are also the trustees or directors of this organization, the IACDA, really obviously demonstrates that this had a tremendous amount of influence and power, not only in the county, but also in Des Moines as well, which the IACDA was not shy about using to their own advantage. Nevada, of course, was incredibly frustrated by this and gave vent to their frustrations in the newspapers throughout most of 1870, 1871, and into 1872. And indeed, to be fair, the IACDA was somewhat of a juggernaut. Its moves were well planned and well executed to ensure maximum effectiveness and efficiency. In addition to prominent IAC city and leading agriculturalists around the state, the IACDA also had the backing of some of the wealthiest men in Ames, most notably our dear friend Lucien Q. Hoggett. On the 2nd of May, 1870, Colonel Hoggett and his wife Abigail sold a substantial 100 acres of land on the eastern bank of the Squaw Creek to the IACDA for a pretty significant sum of $2,000. The new home for the IACDA to host fairs at 100 acres was 4 times the size of what Nevada had been able to appropriate that same month. It sat between the land for this fair in Ames, sat between the college and the town along a significant water feature and hard by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad that could easily and inexpensively have built spur lines running into the fairgrounds. It seemed to be, in the minds of the Ames folks at least, a perfect place to run the county fair. Well, elements in Nevada squealed foul in the newspapers, the pro-Nevada elements, no matter how hard they tried, could only mount a feeble defense of buying 24 acres in and around the county or the city of Nevada for their fair that would actually try to compete against this. Having secured what it believed to be a permanent site for the new county fair through the services of the IACDA, Ames began to take aim at the jail and the courthouse. And of course, Ames knew that the bond issue for the jail in Nevada had not gotten out of the board in 1869, let alone gone before the electorate. And in 1872, the Ames City Council seized on the opportunity left by the void of no courthouse, no permanent courthouse, and no permanent jail to push the edge of the envelope a little bit. And they voted to build a 1-cell brick but fireproof jail in the city of Ames. By 1872, the struggle for the courthouse and the county seat seemed to be falling in Ames's favor. The western part of the county by 1872, actually 1870, but sort of 1872, was rapidly overtaking the eastern part in terms of population. And through collaboration with educational leaders of IAC, Ames had access to a pool of skilled agricultural and mechanical artists they could use to their advantage, and they did. By securing land for the county fair, a perfect venue for it, approving at least the building of an escape-proof jail, it seemed that in 1872, at least from Ames's perspective, they were giving the county board and the citizens of the county, in essence, a fait accompli. Because if you build all this stuff in Ames and it all begins to flow to Ames, and we only have a wooden courthouse in Nevada, there's no reason to not bring everything to Ames. And had Ames's gambit worked, and it came close to doing so, Ames would have been at the intersection of the Chicago and Northwestern and the Iowa and Minnesota railroads, would have hosted the county fair, held the courthouse, held the jail, and the ag college. As such, Ames would easily have been the most important city in the county, and all matters of importance would have flowed to it. And where all matters of importance went, population followed, and money flowed. Sadly, for Ames and its allies in this fight, their plans fell to ruin in 1874. Some of this collapse lay well beyond the power of the pro-Ames forces to contain or control. The global depression, called the Panic of 1873 in the US, hit the United States in September of that year. Farm prices collapsed, unemployment rose sharply, careers were ruined, and life savings were erased. How the economic downturn impacted the IACDA and the plans of its leaders in exact detail may never be known for certain, but the collapse in the farm prices and the constriction of the money supply led to the IACDA having to file bankruptcy in 1874. And the lands that it owned, that beautiful 100-acre plot near the Squaw Creek between Ames and the college alongside the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, the perfect location in the minds of the investors, had to be taken into receivership. The investors lost their money and saw their dreams of profit power and influence vanish, just as they reached out their hands to seize it. But good political maneuvering never yields to economics alone, and the leaders of the Ames group who wanted the county seat were not ready to yield to Nevada, economic downturn or no, and one last round had to be played out. The controversy that sparked this last round of the courthouse fight came in the summer and autumn of 1874, when the county board again came before the electorate seeking money to build a new permanent courthouse in Nevada. This time, the county board split 2-1 over whether to put forward a bond issue. But they did. And they offered up another $40,000 bond issue, 10-year life of the bond, and a 10% rate of return, hoping to get enough money and attract enough investors to actually, get the job done. As it had in the 1860s, Ames again led the charge against a new courthouse. The Nevada Representative, a relatively new newspaper by this point, knew that the bond issue in November was really a referendum on where the county seat would be located, and they just made no bones about it. The paper clearly wanted the courthouse to remain in Nevada, but they could not deny the argument of the pro-Ames element that the western part of the county, that part to the west of the Skunk, was much more thickly populated than the older eastern part of the county, that part east of the Skunk. Nevertheless, the representative called on its readers to vote for Nevada and vote for the courthouse. Not surprisingly, the issue was contentious, and the pro-Ames faction was by no means above passing misinformation or what we in our time might call fake news to gain the support for their cause. The Nevada representative reported in late October of 1874 that a man from the western parts of the county had come to Nevada one day early in October, claiming that Ames should have the courthouse because Ames was in the geographic center of the county. And that just made the most sense in his mind. When the gentleman from the western parts was actually shown a map that we saw at the beginning of the slideshow that clearly demonstrates that Nevada is the geographical center of the county, he was reportedly stunned and said, "By God, I have been lied to." Fake news, outright lies, and political machinations continued as election day neared. And perhaps, not surprisingly, IAC became involved in this close and important bond issue. Both President Welch and the faculty pressed IAC students who could vote, i.e. young men over the age of 21, to register in Story County and vote against the bond issue. The fact that students who owned no land in Story County and that they were voting in a bond issue with those who did own land in the county and had a vested interest in it made Nevada and its supporters see red. And a war of words between the two communities ensued. It played out in the newspapers. However, when the votes were counted after the bond issue went before the electorate in November, the bond issue for the courthouse passed. 1,019 votes in favor, 959 against. Thus, only 60 votes. The vote was not only close, but perhaps not too surprisingly, it broke along sectional lines. Every township east of the Skunk voted for the measure. Every township west of the Skunk voted against it. It was clearly divisive, and the one that the verdict of the electorate did not settle. Rumors circulated within days of the counting of the ballots that some of the ballots from Washington Township, where IAC sat and sits, were cast by illegally voting students. And so these were thrown out. Other accounts said that all of the ballots that had been cast had not been counted. Some of them had gotten lost or deliberately thrown away. And again, the rumors in the newspapers play out that these were from the western townships in the county, those over the western side of the Skunk. And of course, Ames, leading the charge against the bond issue for its own purposes, complains and grouses and whines. Out of frustration, Ames contested the result and demanded a recount. In turn, Nevada vigorously protested the student participation in the election. Nevada argued that because many of IAC students were not permanent residents in the county and they held no land in the county, they had no right to vote there. When this argument fell on deaf ears, Nevada went so far as to take out criminal indictments against all the students who voted in the election for voter fraud. The case went to court, and it was adjudicated at the district level by Judge John Bradley in April of 1875, when he agreed to Ames's request and oversaw the counting of the ballots. Bradley's opinion was that 43 IAC students had voted for the bond issue election, or voted in the bond issue election, and he only allowed 3 of that number to be counted because those were 3 students that actually lived in Story County and had registered in Story County before all this mess began. The others were interlopers or carpetbaggers or whatever horrible term you want to use. They were just simply discounted. Undaunted, Ames filed a bill of exceptions with the court on April 21st, 1875, appealing Bradley's decision to the Supreme Court in Des Moines, which would not take up the case until December of that year. Payne observed that things could have become really unpleasant, but cooler heads prevailed. Ames eventually withdrew its complaint to the Supreme Court, and Nevada eventually dropped their indictments. The new courthouse passed to Nevada, and Ames's ambitions to become the county seat simply vanished, like a chimera. Ames's failure to block the bond issue meant that the handsome Italianate brick courthouse and jail would go to Nevada. But the rivalry between the two, at least on Ames's part, never quite went away, at least for a while. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, the Ames Intelligencer, along with the Ames Times, that began publication in 1892, continued to publish antagonistic comments, snide remarks, and sometimes things that made no sense about Nevada and its citizens on an almost weekly basis. The title of this little talk comes from the January 13th, 1893 edition of the Ames Times, about Ames people eating bear meat. The Ames-Nevada rivalry only subsided in the mid-1890s after Ames became much larger and, in its opinion, more important community than the county seat. Although, as the picture here shows, some in Ames were not above making reference to moving the courthouse from Nevada even as late as 1909. But by the turn of the century, with the Nevada defeated, if you will, in the mind of these Amesites, they began looking for a new urban rival. And they found one in Boone. But that is a different story for a different time. So thank you very much for coming, and I would love to take your questions. Oops. There we go. Do we have anything in the Q&A? Let's see if I can get this to work quick. The fairgrounds were the land that was purchased in Ames was where Riverside Drive is, with hard on the eastern bank of the Squaw Creek, and between what we call Lincoln Way and the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, or the Union Pacific today Railroad. There's about 100 acres in there that was set away for that. And it was, this is well before the Dinky, so that line isn't there. But this would have been a really good place to have the fair, smack in between the Ag College and in between the city, and with the railroad right there, and a major water feature to provide all the water and sanitation you needed for a fair with animals and everything else. It would have been, at least in the minds of Hoggett and Welch and West and others, Lucas, etc. It would have been a really good place to have a farm, or the farm, have the county fair. Anything else? Anybody got? Yeah, Hoggett was really important. Lucien Hoggett was a very, very important guy. And, not only, did he owned a huge amount of land in what we now call Ames. And in a way, Lucien Hoggett's kind of a sad case, as best I can tell, because as a younger guy, he owned huge amounts of land. And he sold them in pieces to try to make more money from the sale of his land, and it it kind of backfired on him throughout his life. He didn't die a pauper, but he was not as wealthy as he was maybe in his 40s. So yeah, you're right there, Kathy. He's a really interesting guy. I wish we could find more on him. But if you dig through the newspapers, you can find a lot of passing references to him and to the things he does. And if you run over to the courthouse, or not the courthouse, sorry, the administrative center in Nevada, you can actually go through the records and you can find that he was busy buying and selling a lot of land. So yeah, very important guy. Oh, there's a whole bunch of them here. Bring them up. Nevada bought that 24 acres, which has now been expanded, in 1868. That's when Nevada bought that land. As far as I know, I think that's the same land that is the current county fair, the core of it. No, Nevada never contended for the Ag College, John, because the Ag College had to be platted because of the way Boone promised to raise so much money to give to the state, part of that $20,000. It was always going to be further to the west, because remember, there's no railroad yet in 1858, and they hoped there would be a railroad, but nobody knew there would be one. So they had to plat it out near Boone. And really, when you think about it and you read about early Iowa State history, there's just nothing out there. It's just high prairie, and it's very boggy. It's not the best place to put virtually anything. But the farm went in 1858, and it was operating within the first year. And the college doesn't actually, because nobody funds it until you get the Morrill Act that's coming out of Congress, and then there's enough money to give them the land to build the stuff. And they started building what became the Main in 1864, but the workmanship was so shoddy that actually they had to tear the whole thing down and start again after the war, and you ended up with what became Old Main until it burned down. So Nevada never. No, I mean, the old story that I was always told growing up was that, Nevada was given the choice of either you get the courthouse or you get the stupid Ag College. And they were like, oh, dude, you want the courthouse. So that's not true. The courthouse was, it was platted to Nevada in 1853, long before anybody thought about an Ag College, because the Ag College doesn't show up until 58. So, well, it's provided for in 58, but nothing ever actually happens. The state doesn't provide any money for it. And the building doesn't start until 64. So, yes, Frankie, that's right. That's the old courthouse. They tore the pretty cupola off in the 1950s, I think, because the pretty cupola was deemed unsafe. It was condemned, and so they took it off. Although the Justice statue is still preserved in Nevada, so it's still there. Oh, the one in Nevada, no, that is the 1876 courthouse. That's the pretty brick one, and that got torn down to be replaced by what is now the administrative center, which was the courthouse for years until they built the new Justice Center in the new millennium. How had the atmosphere changed? Can I ask you to help me, Jane, please, and kind of help me out with your question? 1968? In terms of the new courthouse? Is that what you're asking? I think. Because the courthouse by the late 60s was in really bad shape. It was too small. Too many people moved into the county. The county become very, wealthy by comparison to when it was built in 1876. So it was an old building and had to go. Yeah.
Douglas, there's a question in chat too that says that who were some of the most vocal Nevadians arguing to keep the county seat in Nevada?
That I did not take down because I didn't, I don't know any of the Nevada folks. And I just didn't, I've got their names in my notes, but I didn't, put them in the paper. I had to dig it up. So it's kind of a non-answer, but sorry. Let's see what else we got. I guess that's it.
Yeah, that's all I'm seeing for questions as well.
Cool.
Yeah. Any last minute? Nope, none last minute coming in. All right. And
Thanks everybody for coming. I greatly appreciate you guys all coming out. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Doug.
thanks for the presentation, Douglas. I really enjoyed it.
You bet. Anytime.
I really appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Take care, everybody. Be safe.